My name is Simon Stutterford. There are a lot of misconceptions in relation to nuclear power. This discussion today will look to dispel some of those misconceptions. Nuclear power, in essence, is thermal power generation. That means that fuel is used to boil water to turn into steam, which drives turbines. Exactly the same method that is used in relation to coal or gas-fired power stations. One of the misconceptions raised in relation to nuclear power concerns safety, and we address this issue head-on in today's discussion. Another misconception, which is often shown in photos of nuclear power stations, is huge chimneys bellowing out copious quantities of smoke. In practice, these are cooling towers and they are emitting steam. So today we're looking to have an objective discussion about nuclear power and its role in our decarbonisation efforts. And I'm joined today by my colleague Andrew Renton. Andrew, why do we think now is the right time to be having a discussion about nuclear power?
There are a number of factors, Simon. The climate change debate and the decarbonisation debate are both having an impact on considerations around power generation and political decision making. I believe there's even greater urgency now. On the 13th of September, Christina Figueres, who was one of the leading authors of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and is the founder of Global Optimism, said that unless we accelerate our decarbonisation efforts, the world is facing a catastrophe where large parts of the globe will become uninhabitable for human beings. Most of the reports that have been released this year into power generation confirm that nuclear power generation must be part of the generation mix. More importantly, they say that without nuclear power generation, the decarbonisation objectives for 2050 cannot be achieved. In other words, no nuclear power, no decarbonisation.
So what's the evidence for the role that nuclear power can play?
We've done a lot of research on this. Institutions such as the OECD, the European Commission, the International Energy Agency have stressed the importance that nuclear power generation can play in meeting the low carbon objectives set for 2050. Last week at the International Atomic Energy Agency's convention in Vienna, they announced that they were working together with governments and industrial leaders to achieve cooperation for use of nuclear power generation across the world. That, in my recollection, is the first time that that has happened. And they have produced a graphic which shows the size and scale of change that's required in order to achieve the decarbonisation objectives of 2050. That feeds into the level of urgency that people like Christina Figueres is urging on COP26. In my view, the governments should be engaging and cooperating among themselves and with others to make nuclear power generation for all countries available at a reasonable cost.
And it's interesting to note in that regard that the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, as recently as 25th of September, said that investment that's being considered now in relation to nuclear energy infrastructure should have been made 10 years ago. And we agree with that comment.
Yes, we do, yeah.
So why has this not happened to date? Why is it so difficult to persuade people that nuclear power is the right solution?
My view is the media have become indoctrinated to some extent by the PR and lobbying of other energy interests. They've stopped listening to some extent to the experts, and so what is being said publicly about nuclear power generation is largely misinformed comment. But now that we see the price of oil and gas increasing and the cost of energy going up, people are starting to pay attention to other forms of power generation. My view is that this is happening largely because oil and gas companies may see that they have a time limit on their survival as businesses, that they're capitalising and maximising profit because they have no option. And really the public has no option but to buy their products because they are the only producers of stable electricity. This is a result of the decision of politicians not to support nuclear power generation 10 years ago, as you've mentioned. In my view, it's now time for politicians to make decisions about nuclear power generation being part of the generation mix, and to take forward what is intended from COP26 as a process for decarbonisation of the planet.
Okay, but how do we persuade people that nuclear power is part of the solution to our decarbonisation efforts? And we do hear frequently raised questions in relation to safety and waste. So let's look at both of those issues. Perhaps we start with safety.
As you know, Simon, I've done a lot of work on safety of nuclear power stations, and I've written articles about it since the mid-1990s. And that's because in the early 1990s, the scrutiny of safety and security at nuclear power stations began to become topical. As a result, nuclear science has developed and nuclear engineering has progressed significantly to make nuclear power stations among the safest places in the world to work. And the engineering that's used in nuclear power stations is now used in aviation, space exploration and other fields. So we can be sure that the engineering that is going into nuclear power stations is robust, secure and safe.
So a common view expressed by the public is, people say, when nuclear accidents happen, they tend to be major accidents. So if we take two examples, Fukushima and Chernobyl, what can we say about those?
As you know, I have strong views about the way Fukushima is referred to, because Fukushima is actually two nuclear power stations. It is not the natural disaster that caused 20,000 deaths in Japan. In fact, only one person died in the Fukushima power station because they were in an area which was engulfed by water. So there was no radiation exposure which caused a death in Fukushima. When people see Fukushima and think about it as a nuclear accident, it wasn't. In fact, it was a tsunami, it was a natural disaster, and more attention should be paid to the 20,000 people that died rather than the one person or the one non-nuclear incident at the Fukushima plant. Chernobyl's different. Chernobyl was a nuclear accident. It was a failure in structural design, it was a failure in instrumentation design, and it was a failure by human beings who were seeing information being given in the plant which they didn't act on at the correct time. It was a tragedy and affected the lives of many people. Many more people have long-term illnesses as a result of radiation exposure. That event created a safety culture which makes nuclear power generation now extremely safe. And if you ask people in the industry, could Chernobyl happen again? The unequivocal answer is no, it can never happen again.
So the second of those issues that's frequently raised by the public in relation to nuclear is waste. What do we say about waste?
Well, I think we need to remember, Simon, that all forms of power generation create waste. The issue with nuclear waste is that in the early days we didn't really think about the waste, and in the 70s and 80s we started to think about it. In the 80s and 90s we created a fund and an authority who would take responsibility for the decommissioning of nuclear power stations, making sure that they were safe, and removing the waste and putting it into storage. About 1% of the whole waste that comes from a nuclear power plant. It's high-level waste, which is what people get excited about because it needs to be put in canisters. It has what is called a half-life of 3,000 years or more. It needs to be in geological repositories or otherwise safely stored. And so when you're talking about this amount of waste, you have to be careful to put it in the context that it can be stored safely, it can be stored underground, and it is a very small proportion of the size of a nuclear power station that you see. In modern power stations, every power station that is built must have a decommissioning strategy and a way of funding its decommissioning and the storage of its nuclear waste. So no new nuclear power station can be built anywhere in the world without having a decommissioning and waste fuel storage strategy. I think that waste as a legacy issue has been dealt with badly. It could have been dealt with better, but as an issue now being dealt with, it is being dealt with very well, and there are secure ways of dealing with it. I think the future, what are called Generation 4 technologies, produce very low amounts of waste. And so all nuclear developments in the future are going to have much lower volumes of waste and a secure way of dealing with it at the expiry of the life of the power station or when the waste is removed.
So another topic that's frequently raised in criticism of nuclear power stations is the tremendous cost involved. What can we say about the cost?
People are right to be concerned about the capital cost of large nuclear power stations, but you have to bear in mind that that cost is spread over 60 to 100 years. And the cost of electricity from those power stations is actually comparable to other forms of generation. So it's not the case that the capital cost increases the cost of electricity disproportionately. The capital cost is there because it provides such a long-term stable cost of electricity, which is great for the economy and predictability of costs for manufacturing and other things in the future. And in relation to levelized cost, the graphic produced by the International Energy Agency confirms that nuclear is a very low cost of electricity in comparison to others, and it has a very low carbon footprint. Nuclear power stations are built to last for up to 100 years. Other types of generation are built to last 15, 20, 25 years. And that's the reality of why nuclear power stations cost so much money.
So if we look ahead, what does the future of nuclear power look like, do you think?
So we see the future of nuclear power as being small modular reactors with more versatility used in desalination and hydrogen projects. The objective is to build them in a factory environment and then ship them in modules to a site and assemble them on site. They can be located closer to places where they will be used. They can provide long-term, sustainable, low-cost electricity. I think there's a strong case to argue that SMRs in particular should be one of the leading types of power generation in the future. But remember that all of the world's leading scientists and economists who have written about this in the past year have agreed that nuclear power generation is an essential component of the decarbonisation objectives for 2050.
Yeah. Our objective today has been to clear up some of the misconceptions around nuclear power and ultimately to let people make up their own minds as to whether they feel that nuclear power ought to be part of our decarbonisation efforts in relation to energy generation.